Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Reopening Your Workplace in the Pandemic, What You Need to Know. My name is Paquette. I'm a partner in our Toronto office, and today I am joined by Raphaël Buruiana, who is an associate in our Montreal office, Richard Savage, who is an associate in our Vancouver office, and Rachel Younan, who is an associate in our Toronto office. So we have a nice brochette of cross-country specialists at your disposal today. I call them the 3 R's, Rachel, Richard, Raphael, and I am the odd man out. On that silly observation, just 3 housekeeping points before we dive into our topic today. There's certainly a lot of grounds to cover. First of all, there's a survey I'd like to mention. At the end of the seminar, you'll receive, you'll see a survey link underneath the video. We would appreciate it if you could fill that out. The survey helps us improve our seminars, of course, as speakers, but they also help us to determine our next topics to cover. So your input is very appreciated, and please do take a few seconds to complete that. The second housekeeping point is questions. I am sure that there will be many, and we do have a period of time dedicated to questions at the end of the program. You can actually send your questions in at any time. You can enter your questions in a chat box below on your screen. We will try to address as many of your questions as possible, but of course, if you have any further inquiries, please reach out to our speakers directly. You'll find our contact information, in the presentation materials and on Fasken.com. Now, a quick bit of shameless promotion, if I may. We have a number of upcoming COVID-19 related webinars. We also have pre-recorded seminars. So you can visit the Fasken Institute section of Fasken.com to see what is next and what is available from what you may have missed. Our COVID-19 Knowledge Center on Fasken.com is continually updated with bulletins, blog posts, upcoming webinar information, and you'll find more information, of course, on how to register to receive notifications, bulletins, etc. online on our website. Now, opening remarks, that would be me with my pre-COVID-19 haircut, if you don't recognize me. And let me please present our agenda for the program. So, general considerations that every organization should think about when reopening, that will be presented by myself. My colleague Rachel will be discussing health and safety precautions that apply to every workplace, while Raphael will be discussing additional precautions that should be considered in certain environments, so offices and industrial establishments like manufacturing, retail, and such things. Richard will talk about employee absenteeism, work refusals, and we will end with a Q&A. Hopefully, we'll have those 23 minutes if everyone keeps time, and there will be some closing remarks. Okay, general considerations. So the first thing that I want to talk about is a task force. Some of you may have a version of that already in play, but it really is a critical part of reopening the business, in my view. The objectives of the task force would basically be to prepare for the reopening, so that's one thing, but it's also a task force that should be making adjustments and improvements along the way, planning strategically really for further potential workplace disruptions, because we don't know how the situation is going to evolve and whether certain sectors will be forced to perhaps reduce their operations again. And so that is a very critical component of your return to work plan. So basically this could be a group of staff who would give some thought to or operationalize, if you will, all of the considerations really that we'll be discussing today. So all of the elements of this PowerPoint presentation that you'll see, that should be on the mind of this task force. Organizations should, of course, give some thought to who will be on this task force. That could include, obviously, members of the leadership team. Given that there are potentially financial repercussions to the decisions made, someone from finance or accounting should probably be on board as well. HR is a must, of course, and the organization should consider having people well-versed in health and safety. You might have a joint health and safety committee, so that would be a good place to look for some resources in that regard. And you may have people as well that you want to bring on board with certain expertise in operations on the ground, so that you can know what measures can't really be implemented in practice. And of course, this may also be the time to consider whether you need to hire external consultants to seek advice or to have kind of a seat at the table. So you may have health and safety experts. You may want to consult, of course, legal counsel, may have medical experts that you want to bring on board as well. So what are the duties of the task force and what authority they have? Those are two other key considerations. Maybe you want this task force only to be providing advice to leadership, but maybe you want to give them the authority to actually make decisions in some cases, or have the final say on who returns to work, when they return to work, coordinate all the work that has to be done towards the reopening, setting priorities for the organization, ensuring that there are follow-ups for any kind of work that's being delegated, whether it's reviewing policies and procedures or making sure that some logistical challenges are being followed up upon. I think it's important to stress the coordination and communication that's important within an organization, and in times like these. You all know that things have moved very, very fast so far. Some managers might not know where to turn. Employees as well, things might change for them when they return to work. They might not know what the position of the company will be on various issues, and what the expectation is going to be in terms of returning to work and new policies and procedures to follow, etc. So it's important that there be kind of I'll call it a central nervous system like this task force that can both disseminate consistent information and receive some information from managers and employees as well, potentially on the ground, so that the company can be proactive really in addressing hiccups as they come along. So communications with employees, with management, with stakeholders, that would also be important to be funneled through potentially this task force. Consistency is also important. I want to outline that right now. It's consistency in how we address various issues on the ground in the workplace. And it's important really, not only because it might affect the morale of employees who want to be treated fairly, but it can be an issue as well with respect to certain vulnerabilities to complaints. So human rights, employment standards, health and safety. It's very difficult to say to an employee that you can't do something for him or her if the employee is aware that a manager has given an authorization to other employees to do something. So that can lead to, like I said, employee morale issues, but also question marks, and employees can perceive that they're a victim of discrimination or perhaps bad faith or harassment if they are treated differently. Now, the second point is contingency planning. We are already getting a little bit of guidance from some provinces as to the next steps in reopening for business. One of the critical points, of course, is when are summer camps going to open, whether they can open, whether schools can open. We have some plans, for instance, in place on various levels in Saskatchewan, Quebec, British Columbia, Ontario. The plans are a little bit murkier, perhaps. Other provinces have made certain announcements as well, but so far, Quebec is the only province who is, to my knowledge, as of today, opening schools in the foreseeable future. So we know that Quebec will be opening some schools next week, and those would be elementary schools, while Cégep and universities are going to continue with telelearning. We've heard today that Montreal will delay their opening of schools until at least the end of May. And we know that some jurisdictions, including British Columbia, are looking to make certain announcements. School attendance might be voluntary, but it remains to be seen. So it's important to plan for all of those scenarios. There's a lot of talk about the new normal, but we don't really know what that's going to look like. What we do know is we've heard that there could be other waves of infection. There could be some shutdowns of sectors again, right? So in other words, the lockdowns could fluctuate from one province to another, one municipality to another potentially. There could be an order, of course, from health and safety inspectors to shut down some operations, at least part of some operations. And in fact, the company may itself, without having those kinds of order in place, even consider in some circumstances shutting down parts of its operations. So it might be obvious to say this, but we have to plan for the unexpected, really, and for those various scenarios. So now's the time to really think about what went well and what went wrong so far as the last few weeks have unfolded. It's an opportunity to maybe make improvements to allow more efficient remote work. What equipment do employees need? Perhaps now's the time to survey employees and to survey managers to find out more in that regard and to make investments in that regard. Obviously, there's some consideration that has to be given to investing in personal protective equipment and cleaning supplies, to what sort of measures to take if supply chains get cut out. Do we have to have reserves of certain stocks? Should we have an alternative supplier lined up? Can we shift production somewhere else, to another facility perhaps, or another part of this facility if the need was to be? Unfortunately, another difficult part of the conversation is we'll call it succession planning, because some employees may very well fall ill. Some employees may be forced to quarantine again for one reason or another. And some employees may have, of course, childcare obligations or have to take extended leaves to care for family members. So the bottom line is that some people who the organization was counting on might not be there anymore, or might be unavailable, I should say, for some time. So who can we cross-train to perform some duties, maybe on different lines or different shifts? Who can be acting X, Y, and Z while an employee is unavailable or has reduced availability? What training gaps do they have, and how can we close those gaps? In other words, how can the organization deal with those Plan B scenarios, prioritize resources where they are vulnerable, and that really includes things like even securing more bandwidth for remote workers, or maybe securing some contractors in case we need extra support if someone falls ill, etc. So those are all things that are part of the contingency planning that the multidisciplinary task force should be considering. Of course, restrictions and reopening, that's kind of one of the very fundamental considerations. It'll be to monitor in each jurisdiction what business can operate. And in some cases, this might be that only aspects of your business can actually operate. You should be seeking some further advice in that regard. Jurisdictions have varying requirements, and there are, in some cases, very hefty fines for breaking the law. Now, there are nuances to consider as to what is an essential business and what part of the business might be essential, which informs, in turn, what workers should be included in the business. There could be a difference, for instance, between someone who is working in sales and account management versus employees who work on front lines of production, warehousing, shipping, receiving, that sort of thing. So really, who is actively engaged in the essential business, and that's a fundamental consideration that will inform the decision as to who can actually come back to work. Of course, you want to monitor this because it means that it can impact your suppliers. It can also mean that it might impact schools, daycares, summer camps, all of which will have an impact on your workforce. Risk assessment, that's also a must for all organizations, if only because there is a general duty to take measures to ensure the health and safety of employees. That means that employers have to do their due diligence. They have to conduct a risk assessment of their workplace. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. Now, there are some tools online that some employers can access. There's certainly some from the federal government on public health websites that are available that offer a good starting point to think about that. So I encourage you to go online, have a look, and of course, keep everything that you have in terms of due diligence for that risk assessment in writing so that you have it in case you need to, first of all, defend a decision down the road, and two, have something concrete to work with if you need to make changes along the way, perhaps as you receive feedback from your managers and your employees, and maybe sometimes stakeholders. I would say that as well as kind of a general consideration, if remote work remains a possibility, then I encourage employers to really think about that. If not just because it might diminish the risk of people contracting the virus in the workplace and or infecting other employees. As far as developing written policies to address the COVID-19 related workplace hazards, well, that's of course a priority. The organization should be developing written policies to address workplace hazards that have been identified in the risk assessment that I've just discussed. I know that some of my colleagues will talk a little bit more about this, so I won't necessarily dwell on it very long, but the idea is that employees should know what is expected of them. It should be easy to follow those policies and procedures. They should be easy to understand, and they should be communicated to employees. And reminders should also flow from that as often as possible. Now, other general considerations, physical workplace layouts, this again depends on the risk assessment. I know that Raphaël will talk about this a little bit further, but there may be the necessity to put barriers in front of service points. There might be requirements to sit staff further from each other so that you can respect these 6 feet apart, the social distancing rules. It might be as simple in some cases as well as changing the configuration of a workspace so that employees aren't talking to each other in front of each other when they're performing a task or they're on the phone, etc. Generally speaking, I can say that you should pay close attention to how to minimize certain high traffic areas that can be touched, like doors. Do you need someone to open the door? Is there a button that someone could push instead? Should we have perhaps a doorbell, an orderly lineup marked on the floor in case lots of people arrive at once? Give some thought to maybe hiring or assigning someone to monitor the entrance with personal protective equipment. That person can direct traffic, And that person should also probably be trained on, what to do with some problematic cases. So if someone comes in and seems to be ill, for instance, or some people are not complying with the instructions. And this really touches on the workplace access points. Where are people entering? When are they coming in, and why? The idea really is that we want to limit how many people are congregating at those access points, and find solutions to minimize that. So it could be dedicating some entrance points only for employees, and maybe staggering when employees come in. How to deal with visitors and contractors. Should they have a separate entrance, or maybe call a number to be greeted by someone upon their arrival, right? This is also the point where self-assessment tools might come into play. These might be the points where you want to have someone trained to react to those self-assessments on the ground. Reviewing your policies on temperature checks are also important considerations. There are some different tests that are being developed right now. Some are more reliable than others. This is a topic that's really fraught with a lot of human rights considerations. And what we do know is that many employers are doing temperature checks. I think that scanning is certainly a different mode of verifying employee health compared to something more intrusive like a blood test or a swab. But again, it really is a medical test, regardless of which way we cut it, whether it's taking the temperature or taking a blood test or a swab. And so I think it really depends on what is your workplace. Is there a bona fide reason why that sort of measure should be put in place? For instance, if there are no outbreaks or very few of them in a particular city or region, there are none in the workplace, it might become very difficult to justify conducting those sorts of measures. So it really is at this juncture something that the employers should be considering very carefully. Certainly what's clear is that you can tell employees not to report to work if they are ill or they have symptoms related to COVID-19, but you should seek further advice in that regard if you intend to do that sort of screening. Just a few more minutes on the last points here, staggering start and end times of employees. Really, you want to think about how you can use those hours to make sure that you have less employees coming in and leaving at the same time. You want to reduce the pressure, in other words, on access points and on common elements of the workplace. That could include work hours. That means breaks as well. It might mean lunchtime. So you need to turn your mind to that. Of course, I open a parenthesis just to mention that when you're thinking about changing start times, work hours, even cross-training employees so that they take on more responsibilities or take an acting role for another position, you need to be mindful, of course, of constructive dismissal and should consider seeking advice if you're going to implement that unilaterally. A phased return to the workplace, that goes into a little bit the contingency planning I talked about earlier, but really that might be driven in fact by regulations and law as they keep changing. But certainly at this point you need to start considering who might be staying on layoff, who returns to work, whether they actually return to the workplace or they should continue to work from home. So the first question really is, who do you need on site and when? You might be able to find volunteers, of course, and if you have vulnerable employees, you may even want to check in with them. If you know that some employees have already expressed some concerns or some of them have conditions that make them more vulnerable, like respiratory problems or even age, the workers could probably benefit from a communication from management in that regard. So alternating days is along the same line of staggering start and end times, but the idea is if you have employees that can work perhaps remotely, well, that can help limiting the amount of people at the workplace while ensuring that some employees are still able to come in and complete some core tasks that really require their physical attendance, and that warrants close attention. Finally, signage. You've seen them in probably your grocery stores, etc. How does that apply to your business? Can you put some around doors or where people should be lining up, or at workstations? Can you put them on machines and washrooms, that sort of thing? Pay attention, of course, to language barriers depending on your workplace. And I want to note that the Ontario Ministry of Labour has some really useful preliminary ones already available to you on their website. Training on policies and procedures. I simply want to mention on that front that you need to consider whether or not employees can come into work for the training, perhaps in small groups before they return to their actual duties and workstation. Can it be done on computers from home or in another fashion? Those are things to consider. But really, that goes hand in hand with new policies and procedures, and it's also mandated by health and safety legislation. It's also important to have managers in mind. You want to train them on the risk of reprisal, allegation, human right concern, do's and don'ts in that regard. And I'll pass the microphone over to my colleague simply by saying that communication with employees, management, and other stakeholders remains very important. You might want to develop some templates in that regard. And of course, if you are in a unionized setting, you need to be mindful of your collective agreement with respect to the above.
Thanks, Christian. So we're going to talk now a little bit about some health and safety considerations. Obviously, Christian's been taking us through some of those, but we'll get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of those health and safety considerations now. So first and foremost, and something that we've now been practicing for about 4 weeks, I think, is practicing physical distancing. And what we would suggest is that organizations create specific guidelines for employees on how to practice physical distancing in the workplace. Now, this may seem like common sense, but I think we've all probably been in the grocery store line and had someone, come a little too close or not follow the arrows on the floor and so forth. So it's definitely worth taking the time to put a policy in place to give employees guidance on how to practice physical distancing. And paying particular attention to common gathering spaces like cafeterias or lunchrooms, other meeting rooms, and sort of large gathering spaces will be particularly important. Again, we all know now that physical distancing means keeping a distance of at least 2 meters between individuals, and that practicing physical distancing reduces your likelihood of being exposed to the virus. Now, obvious guidelines that could be included in these policies are, for example, to eliminate physical contact with others. And, our normal practices of shaking hands in the workplace will obviously need to be set aside for some time. We can also consider where staff are actually assigned to work in the workplace and how to optimize physical distancing in light of your particular physical workplace. And I think Raphaël will take us through that a little bit more when he speaks, but consider those matters in your policies. We should also consider who employees are in direct contact with. So for example, if there needs to be direct contact with clients or customers, and that contact is essential and can't be avoided, then we should be instructing the client or the customer to maintain at least 2 meters distance from the staff member wherever possible. And as Christian has already alluded to, barriers and other sort of physical controls that could be put in place to reduce that close contact should be done wherever possible. We can also include in our policies implementing systems for virtual or telephone or video consultations when and wherever possible. And of course, postponing non-essential face-to-face appointments or changing those appointments to become virtual appointments. And then as much as possible, and to the extent that your employees are equipped to do so, encouraging work from home wherever possible should really be part of our policy on physical distancing. Now, in terms of daily self-screening protocols, this is something that you may wish to consider. And that sort of self-screening protocol could be implemented by having, for example, passive signage posted at points of entry into your workplace. So those reminders that we've all seen, prompting someone to consider whether they have, for example, been traveling recently or have been in close contact with someone who has tested positive for the virus. It could also include symptoms that are commonly associated with the virus. So again, asking employees to engage in that self-screening on a voluntary basis, and encouraging employees to report in the event that they believe that they may be showing symptoms. In addition, we should, as I was just suggesting, have procedures in place for reporting illnesses. So if you don't already have one in place, now is a great time to turn your mind to exactly what procedure you'd like to have in place to help employees understand what steps they need to take in the event that they believe that they have symptoms of COVID. The steps should include self-assessment. Your policies should include contact information for the local public health authorities, a contact person at the workplace who the individual should be in contact with, and then as well any self-isolation requirements that the organization would expect. Now, if an organization becomes aware of a positive test of an employee at the workplace, the organization should report the result to the ministry, to a health and safety committee, to the union, if there is a union in your workplace, and should also consider whether there are any employees or third parties who may have been in contact or in close contact with the infected employee. And those individuals should be informed of the situation to ensure preventative self-isolation measures are also enforced. Now, of course, anytime we are notifying someone else of another's infection, we should be, to the extent possible, keeping all of personal information private and not disclosing that information to others. So when it comes to personal hygiene, as we've been hearing from public health officials, this is a critical point in reducing the spread of COVID. And in our workplaces, we should be ensuring that there are sufficient hand washing stations available for all employees. As simple as maintaining fully topped up soap dispensers and having water available to employees. Those are, very simple things that we can do, but are going to be very important. To the extent that soap and water are not available in your workplace for whatever reason, we should be providing hand sanitizer. And really, as we've all seen, we're seeing hand sanitizer stations being spread around our workplaces and public places as well. You may also wish to consider including signs in your workplaces around proper hand washing techniques to really encourage proper hygiene in that way. And we'll just switch to the next slide now. So another health and safety consideration is ensuring that proper and frequent cleaning and disinfection is taking place in your workplace. All areas of the workplace should be frequently cleaned to prevent transmission of the virus. And an organization should take particular care to ensure that common contact surfaces, think telephones, computers, desks, cafeteria tables, stairway handles, elevator buttons, different tools and machinery that employees may be using, on operating buttons, that these high contact surfaces are frequently cleaned and disinfected. Setting a schedule with your cleaning staff of exactly how frequently it's going to be done, and having the normal sort of checks to make sure that everything is being done as expected will be important. And employers can also encourage employees to self-clean those high contact areas throughout their workday, providing disinfecting wipes and other cleaning supplies for employees' use. We should also be discouraging as much as possible the sharing of equipment, whether that's telephones, keyboards, desks, or workstations. We should really be discouraging this unless the equipment has been disinfected after each use. And then, of course, in the event that we have a positive test of COVID at the workplace, the organization should, as part of your planning process, you should be thinking about having steps set up and ready to go to ensure a deep clean of the entire workplace before employees actually return to it. As part of our contingency planning, we need to be mindful of continuously assessing our inventory of cleaning products and available resources to undertake the cleaning, whether that's routine cleaning or in the event of a workplace outbreak. And this could include putting in place contracts with third parties to make sure that those measures are in place. Now, of course, we want to make sure that our eating areas are safe. In that respect, we could consider measures such as having staggered breaks to limit the number of employees using a designated eating area at the same time. Physical distancing must be maintained at all times, and as Christian suggested, you might want to consider using markers or blocking off certain chairs to establish appropriate distances to be adopted by employees. Tables should be cleaned and disinfected between each use, and all personal garbage should be removed by the individual and not left for someone else to clean up. So we might want signage in place or training for employees on the expectations in that respect, so that everyone is sort of cleaning up after themselves, including any dishes and cups and utensils. In terms of meetings, having meetings and having visitors in the workplace, for the time being, this should really be discouraged. If face-to-face meetings are required for whatever reason, then physical distancing requirements should be followed, and visitors should be reminded of the organization's expectations in that respect. Adopting measures such as limiting the number of attendees at meetings should be considered. And then, of course, to the extent possible, meetings should be held virtually. One component which I think we probably won't be seeing happening for quite some time is travel for business. So really only essential business travel should be considered at this point, and we should be exhausting all other options before engaging in travel. If travel is required, we should be thinking about ways that we can help employees mitigate the risk of their exposure. For example, if we have 2 employees who are traveling, we might want to consider carpooling to ensure that employees limit their physical contact with others. Of course, we'll need to disinfect the vehicle before and after the trip. And we'll switch to the next slide now. And, you know, I think one important thing to remember is that we're not alone in this right now. And many jurisdictions have released guidance documents for employers who are reopening their workplaces. For example, I believe just last week, Ontario released a number of workplace safety guidance documents for employers as the provincial economy here begins to reopen. Documents are incredibly valuable. They're very technical and sector specific. There's over 60 technical guidance documents, and they were developed in partnership with provincial health and safety associations. So they've been well vetted. They cover a wide variety of industries, including transportation, construction, healthcare, office settings, mining industry, retail, food retail, tourism, hospitality, you name it, it's pretty much covered. And if it's not, certainly, the materials there are still useful to others. And then, in fact, within each industry, there are often a subset of documents, of guidance documents that would help you address different components of a job. So, for example, in the transportation industry, there are documents for fueling precautions and cleaning of vehicles, rest stop hygiene. They really have looked at all aspects of work, and they're a great resource for employers to review. And as we think about how are we doing our due diligence and are we taking reasonable steps to protect workers' health and safety in the workplace, following the guidance in these documents is great evidence that an employer is in fact taking those reasonable precautions and could be helpful in the event of a complaint or inspection down the road. Many guidance documents do go over controls that can be put in place in the workplace to minimize potential exposure. And they also make suggestions as to what sort of personal protective equipment might be appropriate in the event that other controls are not sufficient. And, while I think almost every jurisdiction now has guidance documents, to the extent that your jurisdiction has not yet prepared its own, certainly looking at the guidance materials from Ontario or BC or Quebec or other jurisdictions is still incredibly valuable and will help you as you are thinking through what measures should be put in place in your workplace. And with that, I'll turn it over to Raphaël.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll be speaking more precisely about additional precautions for both offices and industrial establishments. If we could go to the next slide, please. So essentially, there's no current, we're talking here about precaution for reopening offices. In the province such as Quebec, there is no time frame yet even provided by the government, even in 2 months from now, for reopening offices. We're talking about reopening the areas of construction, manufacturers, and retail stores. Those are the 3 areas that are being reopened right now. They're reopened in the rest of Quebec except Montreal, for example, but from Montreal, the reopening went from May 11 to May 18, and just today it was postponed to May 25th. So preparing for reopening an office is a very good thing to do right now, because you have time to implement all the changes that you need to do in order to be ready to reopen when things become, when the situation becomes ready for you to reopen. And in other provinces as well, you may already be thinking about it, or in the near future be able to do it. In that regard, and Christian and Rachel have discussed this a little bit, but in Quebec, there has been a very strong push from the Minister of Finance to tell employees who can work from home that they should work from home. And the same thing goes for Ontario in the guidance documents that Rachel discussed earlier today. They all discuss the possibility, and they strongly suggest employers to allow employees to work from their houses. So for employers who don't yet have a telework policy, it really would be the time to implement one, to make sure that your employees, when they're working from home, they know exactly what they should be doing. Now, if we're talking more precisely about what to do in your workplace once it reopens, and all of the things that we are going to be discussing today, you should really keep track of them and have some sort of journal or a way for you to note everything that you've been doing. And it will become very important when Richard and I later today speak about the investigation process that can happen if an employee refuses to come to work because he says that it's unsafe. But if we're talking right now about physical layout changes, you may have to check your leases for companies that are renting spaces, especially office space. Your lease may allow you to do modifications to the way the physical layout is made, but you may need your landlord's approval. So before doing something, make sure that you got his approval to do so. And if you don't, make sure that it is properly documented so that you can defend yourself if there's something that happens in the future. And this is going to be mostly important for companies. It's very common in the 21st century that companies are having open spaces and shared spaces where you are going to have a big table in the middle of an open space where all employees can come in, sign in for 2-3 days, get a computer, a keyboard, a chair, and 2-3 days after they're moved to a completely different setup and somebody else is taking their chair. So you need to make sure, especially in those setups, but in all setups, that you have insured and cleaned everything appropriately. And the provincial governments such as Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia are telling employers and suggesting very strongly that people do not share keyboards, telephones, chairs, desks. So as much as possible, you would have employees have one desk, one chair, one keyboard. And if you have to have telework for some of your employees and others come to the workplace, it's going to be very important that everything is thoroughly cleaned before somebody else sits on a chair and uses a keyboard that was used by a prior employee to prevent any cross-contamination. In that regard, it would be very important that the cleaning is made by someone by the employer and not by the employee himself. Over the past weeks, we've had videos telling us how to wash our hands, and even for some of us who are 30 and above, it wasn't clear that we were doing it correctly for the past 30 years. So we shouldn't take a risk in letting our employees do this by themselves and probably or not doing it correctly and contaminating others. Same thing could be done for kitchens, chairs in the kitchens, and coffee machines and things like that. We shouldn't leave the employee to do this unless they've been properly trained to do that. In regards to the workplace, you may have to physically distance chairs and desks from one another to make sure that employees respect the 2-meter distance between them, or the 6-foot distance, depending how you calculate distances. And of course, you may have to put walls between them, not necessarily the brownish walls that we often see in some cubicle areas, but you know, it can be like a plexiglass or some sort of glass that makes such that employees can still see each other, still talk to each other. They just can't share basically germs with one another. So these things could be in place right before employees come back to work, and these elements of protection should be cleaned by the employer again. When we're talking about restricting elevator use, now this is something that, again, it may not have anything to do with you. It could be your landlord's elevators. For example, at Fasken's office in the Montreal area, there are 6 elevators that go from floor 33 to 45. Instead of doing that, one of the possibilities that we may be discussing with them is having one elevator go from 33 to 35, one from 36 to 38, one from 39 to 41, things like that, to make sure that there's never at a given time people from 11 floors that can get in the same elevator. That's not only saying there should be a limit to the number of people in an elevator, but it should also be a limit to where those people come from, to make sure that if one person's contaminated on the 44th floor, he's not going to contaminate 35 people from all across the floors of the building. So this is something that could be implemented in excess of simply limiting the number of people in an elevator. And for bathroom, and all sorts of areas that you have, you need to make sure that they're cleaned thoroughly. And your employees are going to be your eyes and ears in that. If they see something that is not okay, they should know that where they can report it to, who they can report it to, and make sure that they're whenever they raise a concern, whether you believe that it's far-fetched or not, you should look into it. And if it's far-fetched, then you let it go. But everything that's reported to you should be analyzed. If we could go to the next slide, please. In regards to industrial establishments, we can go to the next one even. So for industrial establishments, the rules are a little bit, the same rules apply, but there are some rules that are a little bit different and specific to them, especially in regards to changing facilities and showers. So these are things that you don't regularly see in an office, but you will see very frequently in an industrial establishment. Either people have to come in at work in the morning and change into a uniform or into safety instruments and safety uniforms to make sure that they don't get an injury from the workplace. And they're going to have a place where they can leave, like a changing room where they can leave their normal day clothes. You need, again, to make sure that their arrival is staggered, that you won't have everyone coming in the locker room at the same time to change and to shower at the beginning and at the end of shifts, which is going to prevent you having an eclosion of COVID in the workplace if only one employee has it. And so physical distancing should also be maintained in those areas at all times. And where we're talking about avoiding close work, we're well aware that there are certain machinery and certain ways of doing things that make it that in certain industries, it's going to be very difficult for you to have to change a machinery that probably cost a significant amount of money and was made for 4 people to operate at the very same moment. And maybe an alternative that would respect the 2-meter distancing from one another doesn't even exist on the workplace or in the market. So in those ways or in those situations, you need to make sure that non-essential work that would require close contact between employees wouldn't be carried out. If it's not something that you have to do, it's better to just wait out until the situation goes back to normal or the new normal. And limit contact between employees. That can go as far as instead of every employee going from one area of the plant or the company set up to another to deliver machinery or to deliver goods, that you get one person in charge of doing the delivering or changing the operations of the company to make sure that as much as possible, one employee stays in his little area where he's safe from others and all other employees are safe from him, and so on and so forth. Also for company vehicles, and Rachel discussed this a little bit, but for forklifts, company vehicles, they need to be cleaned before anyone else than the previous driver gets on those machineries as well. Tools and equipment, again, as soon as those items have to be used and shared by employees, unless everyone has their own kits, it should be cleaned by the company at any time between the time it is used by one employee and the time it is used by another. And so the same thing goes for protection equipment. If we are talking about some companies are going to provide masks, gloves, or the visors that some companies have been creating in the past weeks. So if the protection equipment is protection equipment that is single use only, then it should be very well signed where they should dispose of the items, and the company or the employer should make sure that this is not reused afterwards by somebody else, and to make sure also that employees do not, for all sorts of reasons, decide that they're going to keep a mask and you wear it for 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row when it's supposed to be for a single use only. And equipment that must be reused, again, should be cleaned by the employer, not by the employee, because we don't want them to wrongly clean it or not clean it from one day to another, and then having an eclosion of COVID-19 in the workplace, where you could have issues such as shutting down or having to test a bunch of your employees or reducing your workforce. Furthermore, and you need to make sure also, and it would be a very good thing to put in place to make sure that whatever contractor or third party has to come into the plant, and the same thing goes for the offices, that they respect the same rules as your employees do, to make sure that you don't get a set of rules that applies to your employees, they're safe and sound, and then somebody else comes from the outside world, doesn't know about your policies, and infects somebody there who by himself infects everyone else inside. So the rules should also apply to all other employees and all third parties who also have to come to the workplace. And with that being said, I now leave it to Richard for absenteeism and work refusals, and I'll have a few comments on the Quebec perspective.
So once you've taken all the steps that Christian, Rachel, and Raphaël have spoken to, if you still have an employee refusing to return to the workplace, there's a number of considerations that you need to follow. And first, we've developed a process for evaluating absenteeism, and this steps you through the things you need to consider. The first is if an employee is eligible for a leave of absence under an applicable statute, either related to COVID-19 or an existing leave of absence. The next is if there's any human rights considerations. This might be due to an employee's disability or a family status accommodation if they have child care or other care obligations. After you've considered those, the next thing to consider is whether the employee is raising a legitimate refusal of unsafe work or potentially an illegitimate one. And if they are doing that, you need to go through the process, and I'll describe that in detail. Then finally, the other thing to consider is if there's other entitlements that might be available to an employee, either contractual entitlements in terms of sick leave or other types of leave, or potentially paid time off for entitlements. If you've gone through those processes and none of the above are relevant, then and only then really is it important to consider disciplinary measures and assess whether they're appropriate. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to speak to employee absenteeism and work refusals with respect to statutory leave. Now, there are COVID-19 related leaves under, for example, in British Columbia, the Employment Standards Act, or infectious disease leave in Ontario. You need to consider whether the employee has made a request for that leave and whether the request is appropriate and complies with the statute in your province or jurisdiction where you're working. The other types of leaves employees might be considering are human rights accommodation leaves. Employees who are vulnerable to the virus or who have a child care obligation or other family member obligation might be entitled to leave under these circumstances. Family status, of course, is an important consideration while daycares and schools are shut down. We note family status isn't recognized as a ground of discrimination in Quebec, and the test is different in British Columbia than in other jurisdictions with respect to family status. So what's very important for any human rights accommodation consideration is to deal with each case on a case-by-case scenario and consider the facts relevant to that requested for accommodation. Accommodations are necessary to the point of undue hardship, and that's really why it needs to be on a case-by-case basis consideration. How can we accommodate this employee if they do have a legitimate disability or need for accommodation through family status, through potentially working from home, scheduling changes, or potentially an unpaid leave so that they can keep themselves safe or comply with their family obligations. On the next slide, I'm going to be speaking to refusals due to unsafe work. Occupational health and safety legislation in all jurisdictions have provisions for work refusals if the employee believes that their health and safety is endangered by a hazardous condition in the workplace, including an infectious disease such as COVID-19. Generally, an employee may exercise the right to refuse unsafe work if they believe they will be exposed to COVID-19 virus in the workplace, which will begin the right to refuse unsafe work process. In certain jurisdictions, the right to refuse work may not be available to employees who provide essential services. For example, if the work being refused involves a risk that is inherent in the part of their job, but it's important to consider a refusal and whether it's relevant to that employee and that employee's circumstances. The right to refuse unsafe work process is generally a 4-step process, the first step being the refusal itself. An organization should already have procedures in place for the investigation of work refusals, and these process and procedures must meet the minimum standards required under the relevant occupational health and safety legislation, and should set out the steps the organization needs to take, which I'm going to go through. After an employee has exercised the right to refuse unsafe work, the employer needs to conduct an investigation. This is where taking all the steps discussed previously by Rachel, Christian, and Raphaël are important so that you've already addressed the common hazards that could be expected to be found in your workplace that have been identified by your risk assessment that you've done. Your investigation will determine whether there's objective evidence that a hazard exists that is likely to endanger the worker and that hasn't been reasonably addressed. If the investigation finds that there's a hazard of exposure of COVID-19 in the workplace, immediate steps must be taken by the organization to protect the health and safety of all persons in the workplace. If the investigation, however, finds that there's no evidence of COVID-19 in the workplace, this must also be properly communicated to the worker so they can understand what steps you've taken as an employer to address the COVID-19 related hazards. If the employee continues to refuse to return to work, you want to be able to show them, here's the objective evidence why it's safe for you to come back. these are the steps we've taken. If they still feel unsafe, in many jurisdictions, this is where you would involve a health and safety worker representative. This might be a member of your Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committee to assist in the investigation and determine whether they believe that you've taken adequate steps. If you've already engaged your Joint Occupational Health and Safety Committee in the processes of developing your practices and procedures to address COVID-19, you likely already have buy-in from them related to any health and safety concerns the employee might be raising. Now, if they believe that it's unsafe, you need to take reasonable steps to address the concerns. If they agree with the employer that it is safe, but the worker is still not convinced, that's when you need to contact an occupational health and safety representative. A government representative responsible for the jurisdiction's occupational health and safety will then conduct an investigation into the work refusal and provide its decision in writing on whether they agree that the workers reasonably exercise the right to refuse unsafe work, or whether they think that the refusal is unreasonable and the worker should return to the workplace. Now it's important to go through this right to refuse unsafe work process, because employees who refuse work are entitled to pay throughout the process while they're in a legitimate refusal. So until you've established that a refusal is not legitimate, either by employee buy-in, by communicating what you've done, or ultimately a decision of the occupational health and safety officer determining that the refusal is unreasonable, that employee may be able to claim wages under work refusal. Now, it's not a valid work refusal for an employee simply to refuse to return to the workplace once it's lawful to do so, after the emergency shutdowns are lifted on the basis they believe they might be exposed to COVID-19 in the workplace. In certain jurisdictions, it's true that a work refusal must be initiated in the workplace, so they must already be attending. But generally speaking, employees have to have a reasonable belief that there's a increased risk of exposure to COVID-19 due to the workplace condition that would be separate than them, staying from home or otherwise operating under the restrictions imposed in their jurisdiction. The same reasoning would also apply to an employee who refuses to return to work due to the possible risk of exposure while commuting to work. Social distancing rules will continue to apply upon return to work, and such rules will be enforced in public transportation and otherwise to ensure that users are far apart and are able to commute safely. As long as protections are put in place at the employee's arrival at work, including access to hand sanitizers or hygiene protocol, or the obligation to disclose if they have symptoms, then organizations can say that they've taken reasonable steps and encourage employees to take protective measures when taking public transportation, notably with respect to social distancing and potentially using personal protective equipment when using public transportation. Now, if you've gone through this whole process, you've considered leaves of absence, you've considered human rights considerations, whether they have other eligibility to take time off through vacation or paid time off that they can exhaust to justify an absence. Only after you've done all this can you consider whether a disciplinary measure is appropriate. Now, I think it's important to note that employees who are on unsubstantiated leaves of absence won't qualify for income assistance such as the CRB or EI, so that might be incentive enough to have employees on such leaves want to return to the workplace, or you may consider it sufficient penalty for an employee not returning to work if they have a concern. But if not, the organization, once going through the right to refuse unsafe work process, can insist that an employee attend work. They can discipline an employee for failing to attend the work, or ultimately they could potentially terminate an employee for job abandonment if the employee continues not to attend work after having been given more than one opportunity to do so. So setting specific guidelines on you've been absent without leave, we're asking you to return to work by a certain date. Please confirm that you'll return to work by that date, or we may need to take further disciplinary action, including termination, giving them clear warning that their job is at risk if they refuse to return to work. Now, it's recommended that organizations, when considering something like a disciplinary termination, prepare and send a self-serving letter to these employees outlining the chronology of their refusal to return to the workplace, the reasons why the worker refused, steps you've taken, such as considering accommodation, or if it's a human rights issue, or the right to refuse unsafe work process and the steps you took there, to accommodate any employee concerns, and clarifying it's a requirement for them to return to work to continue their job attachment. It's important to provide employee with the opportunity to comply with these requests before proceeding with discipline or termination. And it's another opportunity in such a self-serving letter for an organization to remind employees that they won't necessarily qualify for CRB, and that you will have to issue a record of employment reflecting the refusal or resignation because of their refusal to attend work. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to talk about some things that you might want to consider if you decide to provide a gratuitous leave of absence or an accommodation generally. To the extent practical, you want to engage, as I was saying before, on a case-by-case assessment of which individuals actually require accommodation under human rights, be it family status or physical disability grounds. If the employees are not covered under human rights accommodations, you may want to allow requesting employees to post availability among themselves to arrange coverage, so that if they have obligations outside of those protected, they can establish coverage within the workplace, and you can maintain operations. Organizations can establish reoccurring deadlines for this process and potentially assist in adjudicating outstanding issues if there's not adequate availability for individual schedules. Another thing that we've heard before is providing staggered or rotating leave of absence if you have employees who don't want to return to work, or you have concerns with not being able to provide social distancing in the workplace and you want to resume partial operation. Another possibility potentially is to allow employees who have childcare obligations to bring their children to the workplace. You might have to retain a childcare professional to provide childcare needs, and of course that's going above and beyond your requirements under human rights legislation or the COVID-19 related leaves, but something to consider if possible in your workplace. Finally, to encourage employees to return and provide, you might want to consider providing incentives to unaffected employees who are able to take on additional shifts or are willing to return to the workplace prior to a more general reopening. Now I'm going to pass it over to Raphaël to speak specifically to the Quebec perspective and some things relevant to employee absenteeism.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, so in regards to investigations, Quebec likes to do things a little bit differently. So here the investigation process is not handled by the employer himself, but by the CNESST, which is a public governmental body. And for this reason, at the very beginning when I said, do monitor everything that you do in the workplace to make sure that it is well documented and that we will be easily able to know exactly what you've done. The reason for that is because in the upcoming weeks and months, it is clear that there's going to be a very important amount of investigations linked with employees who refuse to return to work, saying that they believe that it's unsafe, whether or not they believe that the unsafe part is getting to work, so public transport, or if they have a subjective fear of what's happening in the workplace, or if there's actual real reason for them being scared of catching COVID-19 in the workplace. And when the CNESST is going to do their investigation, if you provide them with all the appropriate documentation with what you've done and how well documented your things are, all the steps you took to clean the places up, all the steps you took to ensure that the employees are well aware of their obligations, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to pass that test of did you take all the reasonable measures, because the CNESST is going to be seeing a lot of cases where nothing's documented, so you will more easily pass that threshold, and the investigation may close even before, very shortly after it began, just because you're well organized. And the second element for us to discuss, and also, by the way, the investigation of the CNESST, whatever finding they make is a final is final. So they may say that you need to modify X, Y, and Z, then you have to modify X, Y, and Z. If you don't, there's penal offenses and things like that. So you have to do the modifications that they say. So the more organized you are at the beginning, the less chances there are that they will do a thorough investigation of your base of your company and find little things here and there. And in regards to statutory leaves and absences here in Quebec, it's again kind of different than what Richard just said, notably on the fact that there's no special COVID leave that was put in place here in Quebec. There were in many other provinces. Here, most probably the government was satisfied that we had enough protection with what was there. So in Quebec, you have 10 days of absence per employee to fulfill obligations relating to the care, health, or education of a child, or the state of health of a relative. So an employee who would say, for example, that they refuse or they don't follow the guidelines that the government said, that they said, well, you can put your kid back to work if you want, back to school if you want, but you can also decide not to. Well, an employee who decides not to would just have those 10 days to take care of their children. They wouldn't have the right to say, well, I'll spend the whole summer with my children and I'm not coming back to work. The government, when they said that there's not going to be an obligation for employers or for parents to put their kids back to school, what they meant is not that they can stay outside of the workplace, it's just that the Education Act that says that school is mandatory just doesn't apply temporarily. So the only days that an employee could have are 10 days, out of which 2 can be with pay unless the employee took sick leaves in the past. So the leaves are very limited here, and contrary to other provinces as well, the Quebec Charter does not protect people against discrimination based on family status. So the mere fact that somebody has a child and have obligations towards them is not grounds for discrimination. If you say, I want all employees to come back to work, of course you need to be aware of certain limits, and that's on the next slide. If we can change to the next one. So and I'll start with the bottom because we tried to surprise you here. But for childcare obligations, if you have an employee who refuses to return their children to school, we're going to have to analyze it on a case-by-case basis to know if there's a measure that can be taken against that employee, if you can go to disciplinary measures for him not showing up to work and eventually thinking that the employee has resigned or will be terminated, or if you have to accommodate him in some ways, because there's the 10-day leave, but if there's, for example, a member of the family who catches COVID-19, then there are other leaves that may apply. And finally, so we do not suggest that you take a one-size-fits-all approach. Employees may have reasons not to send their child back to work because a family member has a compromised immune system or something like that. So you would need to contact a lawyer or contact us in order to determine how to treat a specific situation.
Now, as Richard has already taken us through, we should really be approaching these issues in a methodical, step-by-step. And the first step there may be to consider whether the employee is, for whatever reason, eligible for leave already under the particular workplace employment statutes. So you could offer the employee the option to commence their leave early if they'd like. That would apply to a pregnant employee. For, if the employee is earlier on in their pregnancy and therefore they're not entitled to begin their pregnancy or maternity leave as of yet, then you should really be requesting medical documentation in order to substantiate the employee's inability to attend at work. And you'll want to follow your usual processes there with respect to requests for medical documentation. Now, if the documentation that's provided is unclear, do follow up. And again, if the employee doesn't provide any medical documentation, or that documentation doesn't demonstrate that they can't come to work, then we need to go through the work refusal process and the remaining steps that that Richard and Raphaël have taken us through. Now, as it relates to a pregnant spouse, that wouldn't in and of itself excuse an employee from the obligation to attend at work. But we would need to consider whether there's any need to accommodate on the basis of family status. And in that respect, the organization may need to seek more information from the employer there. And oftentimes we can reassure the employee that steps are being taken in the workplace to really protect them, thinking about PPE, adjustments of work hours, disinfections of spaces, and that may in and of itself excuse or sort of reassure the employee and ensure that they come back to the workplace. I'll pass it to Christian now.
Yeah, so very briefly, because there's some questions here so that we'll try to answer, and hopefully some of the presentation has answered much of them already. But just a word for elderly persons, either workers or people that have elderly persons at home. There was, Raphaël brought to my attention today something rather interesting on the Quebec side, where they expect workers in school settings to come into work if they are less than 70 years old. So I think there's not clear guidance in that regard, but certainly that suggests that unless people are 70 and older, and there could be some controversy there, you might want to set your threshold a little bit older, a little bit lower. You may want to, you could insist, of course, that employees come to work unless they have some sort of other condition making them vulnerable, unless they're 70 years old and more. And at that point, of course, it's the duty to accommodate that kicks in. I would also add that to the extent that people are caring for an elderly person at home, that to my mind, I mean, unless this person again is older than 70, or has some sort of a condition making them vulnerable, maybe a respiratory disease or something like that, just the fact that someone is really living with someone that is older doesn't necessarily mean that they can't come to work. I think that the duty to accommodate, there's a process, and it entitles the employers to get some information from those employees. And who knows, maybe the employees are able to be careful when they're at home and take certain, I'll call them social distancing measures, even within their homes. I mean, at the end of the day, some people are going and they do groceries every day, etc., and they come back to that same household. We have workers in hospitals, etc., that also come back home. So employees have to be obviously careful at work, they have to be careful at home, but it's that same case-by-case analysis that applies.
And then just touching on childcare obligations again. In BC and Ontario right now, as long as schools remain closed, there is protected leave for employees who have childcare obligations. Now, there is an obligation to provide evidence of your need for that accommodation, and if the schools reopen and there's still a childcare obligation and it engages that protected ground of family status, the organization needs to request reasonable information as part of the accommodation process. Employers have a duty to facilitate accommodation. Employees have a obligation to engage in the accommodation process. And for family status, that includes considering whether there's alternative arrangements that are available for the employee to care for their child. They could consider whether a spouse of the employee or an older individual is able to provide home care or whether there's someone else living in the home who could provide care while they're at work, be it a sibling, parent, or relative who's in the home. With human rights accommodations generally, I recommend seeking advice on the specific situation because accommodation issues are so fact specific.
A few questions then that I'd like to pass around here. We've had a lot of questions from people who are in an office setting, and they're not necessarily able to reorganize the office. So they're asking, and I'll ask Raphaël to answer that. They are asking whether or not just putting plexiglass avoids, the necessity to have social distancing.
Thank you, Christian. Yes. So the plexiglass is a good measure. It's the same as it's even probably better than having a mask or having another type of personal protection. It is usually recommended to go with social distancing, and here, authorities have been saying that the best measure is social distancing. However, when it's impossible, or you have to put in place the means and the measures that you can. And sometimes it's going to be a mask, it's going to be a visor or plexiglass, and that would be reasonable enough. Yes.
There have also been some questions about whether or not employers should be reporting employee illnesses, those that test positive for COVID, for instance. So some employers wanted to get more information in that regard. I don't know if there's anyone that wants to address that point.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I mean, I think, generally we should be keeping in mind that the medical professional who actually receives the diagnosis that there has been a positive case does in fact have an obligation to report that positive test to the provincial health authority. So, first and foremost, that's probably already been done. But having said that, you may want to voluntarily contact public health officials to get advice to assist in any sort of contact tracing, any contacts that the infected employee may have had in the workplace. And there may also, and probably is likely also, an obligation under the health and safety legislation to notify public health authorities, particularly if the infection occurred in the workplace or in the course of employment, or where this may have exposed others to the illness.
Absolutely, and also the workplace insurance authorities or whatnot in some cases too. And Rachel, I'm going to trouble you on another one here. Some people are asking, two things related to self-reporting, or I should say self-assessments actually. One, is it necessary to have a self-assessment, questionnaire in place, or is it enough to have just kind of a poster or whatnot that says, do you have these symptoms? If yes, come in. If no, stay home. Right? Does that suffice?
Yeah.
And can you force employees to kind of respond to the questionnaire if you have one?
So I think, the answer to this question is going to be very dependent on the type of workplace that you are dealing with here. I mean, I think, what we're balancing here are health and safety requirements with also being mindful of privacy considerations. As with temperature screening, a questionnaire or a screening questionnaire that you require employees to submit, for example, would have very similar considerations and risks around privacy and human rights potential risks there. So, first and foremost, you want to consider which jurisdiction you're in. Some jurisdictions in Canada do have privacy legislation, which would result in some additional obligations or considerations. But I would say, for the most part, a voluntary screening process where employees, consider them for their own purposes and then self-report and are encouraged to self-report, that would be preferable to any sort of, questionnaire that needs to be submitted in any way and reviewed by someone. I think, if we're going down that road, that should be something that's very carefully considered based on the risks in the workplace and the particular environment that you're in. So I would say for the most part, we want to be doing it on a voluntary basis. And, around self-screening, and I'm being long-winded here, but around self-screening, we have to be thinking about also how we can encourage and motivate employees to actually report. And of course, workplaces where there may not, be benefits available to employees if they have to be, if they have to stay home for whatever reason, we should be reminding employees of the government supports that are available to them in the event that they do become ill, so that we can avoid employees showing up at work sick or with any sort of symptoms merely because they can't afford to stay at home.
And Richard, we've had a couple of questions on accommodation, and one of them is, do I have to pay people that say that they can't come to work because of childcare or because they're refusing to return to work, right? They might be scared of taking public transit or something along those lines.
So if someone's, an accommodation where the accommodation is the worker being put on a leave of absence, those are unpaid leaves, where the workers were, it's really more a job protection that's being enacted at that point. If, you want to consider with employees who are saying because of concerns in the workplace that they would rather work from home, whether you can accommodate that by permitting them to work from home and continue to work. But if that's not possible and you need to accommodate them just by providing them with leave, that leave is not paid.
Now, there's also a question, Richard, on having employees sign some sort of a waiver before they come back to work. Do you have any views on that? Is it useful?
I don't think having employees themselves sign a waiver is useful, because, for example, the workers' compensation legislation protects employers from personal injury claims that arise out of and in the course of employment. So if a worker ultimately caught COVID-19 at a workplace, there's already a process in place to address the damages that flow from a personal injury. And it's an exception in British Columbia, for example, though, that there's also protections under ministerial order for employers providing essential services from liability. I know that's unique to British Columbia, but another thing to consider. So I don't think it's necessary for workers to be signing waivers to return to the workplace. What you need to do is take the reasonable steps that Raphaël and Rachel spoke about and Christian, to develop a risk assessment, assess the hazards in the workplace, develop policies to address those, and then you've done what you need to under your occupational health and safety obligations.
And on that risk assessment, Richard, someone asked, well, do I really need to have someone formal, or does my planning suffice? Is there a magic document that I need to use? And I believe what you're going to answer is there's nothing in particular that needs to be used, provided that you've done it, that you can show you've done it. In British Columbia, however, I understand that for certain industries, you do need to retain experts or whatnot, or have a particular sort of plan.
Right, that's correct. So generally, I think that the guidance is develop written procedures so that if there's a complaint or refusal of unsafe work or whatnot, you have something documented, consistent that you can use to address. But in British Columbia, for some employers, schools, healthcare facilities, things of that nature, there's a requirement for an exposure control plan to be developed, and that needs to be developed in conjunction with a qualified person, and that would be a infection specialist or an occupational hygienist or another practitioner who can provide guidance on whether the steps are appropriate for that workplace. Now, it's just specific workplaces, but if you do not have one developed, it's worth consulting the regulations for schools, healthcare facilities, other facilities where you might have vulnerable populations or employees that need additional consideration.
Excellent. And we're almost out of time here, so let me please thank everyone for their participation, your excellent questions. I want to remind you again that we do have an excellent knowledge center. You have the link on the material that was provided to you. We invite you to subscribe to our HR Space Bulletin for more updates on this matter and others, because there are still other problems to address in the workplace as COVID rages on. And stay safe, be well, and thanks again for your attention, and thank you to my co-presenters.